Hey, welcome to the Virtually Speaking podcast. My name is Pete Flecha, and joining me as always is my good friend, Mr. John Nicholson. John, how you doing, bud?
Good. I'm feeling caffeinated up and ready, but I feel like there's change in the air. Just the weather. It's gotten a little colder, but it's not cold enough for the heat to come on in the office. So it's kind of that like weird middle ground where change is happening, and I'm not sure I'm fully comfortable with it, but I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I'm all sweatered up in North Carolina. You look like you're teed up in Austin. But yeah, change is coming. Lots of cool stuff happening, and I want to get our guest on before we get too deep into it. But we're talking a little vSAN today. Our good friend, Mr. Pete Koehler, wrote an awesome blog on application high availability, whether it's application or at the infrastructure level. So we're gonna bring Mr. Koehler on and see if we can learn a little bit more about this topic. Pete, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Certainly happy to be back here, and we are kind of talking about a little bit of a different topic this go around. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know we always talk about like what's latest and greatest in vSAN versions, this and that, but I think this is a topic that's near and dear to a lot of folks' hearts, especially at the IT practitioner level. There's a lot of folks that are in charge of making sure stuff doesn't go down, making sure there's availability, and there's more than one way to have availability, right? And there's certainly a lot of vulnerabilities in different areas. So making sure you're set up properly, I think, is a very hot topic. So I want to dive into that, but before we do. What's been new in your world? Anything new in the world of vSAN?
Yeah, most certainly. In fact, I think just last week we announced some all new ReadyNode minimums. So we've lowered the hardware requirements on vSAN ReadyNodes significantly, and this was really exciting for us, but especially exciting for our customers, because what it really comes down to is they can spend less money on those ReadyNodes in order to achieve the very same result. So I have a new blog post out on that. And we've also simplified the number of ReadyNode choices that you have available, or the profile. So it should just make that entire design and sizing process easier as well.
Absolutely. And link in the show notes of this podcast to that blog. So we'll be sure to share that. But what's the 2-minute version?
Well, we have lowered the minimum requirements for RAM significantly, most specifically for ReadyNodes that are certified for vSAN storage clusters. So RAM has been reduced by as much as 67%, and we have had 50% drops in the number of CPUs or CPU cores that are needed for vSAN storage clusters. We've also seen modest reductions for ReadyNodes that are running vSAN HCI configurations, but you're going to see the biggest differences there for vSAN storage clusters.
So that RAM reduction, that's really big in the context of what's going on in the industry right now. I'm in the process of currently scoping out a new gaming PC, and oh my goodness, RAM prices have gone to the moon. And I was looking at DRAM Exchange. We can look the spot price of DDR5, like where the market's going. And like this summer it was like $5 a gig or something. And now it's like $20, $30 a gig. And I'm reading these news stories like Samsung increases costs on their customers by 50%. Like there's this giant shortage in memory that's, I know everybody's at end of year. They're getting ready to, those of us in the US are getting ready to eat turkey and go blah, and then, coast into Christmas. But if you're looking at your server purchasing cycles, you're getting your budget refresh in January. A lot of the component costs are actually, specifically RAM is going up because of AI demand and other things. I promise Dell isn't just being greedy this week. And this is something that hopefully will help people quite a bit. And I like that we're kind of reacting to where market sentiment's here, but also like kind of what are some of the other things that are driving this reduction?
Well, we've certainly seen from our customers who are looking at these alternate solutions, that being the fact that we have storage that is built in to the hypervisor. They're looking at this saying, well, you know what? We have our VCF license, and this comes with some vSAN storage. So let's look at what this may result in for their environment. And so then it becomes a simple math equation, or maybe not so simple math equation, depending on the various things that you factor in. But the fact that we can drive that down is really intriguing for our customers. And I think there's also another side benefit to this. Once you reduce those physical resources, it can change the design of your environment. So now all of a sudden you don't have to maybe even buy as many servers, and therefore not use as many network switch ports, and therefore not use as many racks and so forth. So
Second order effects on cost.
yeah, there's a cascading effect on all of this.
Yeah, that sounds like a win for the customer, I'm sure.
No, and it's kind of interesting because when we came out with ESA, we kind of, anytime you come out with a new storage platform, you kind of have to hedge like where you're going to go, because people are buying servers that they're planning on using anywhere from 5 to maybe 6, 7 years if you really drag out your life cycles and you're not Michael Berry this week. But it's one of those things where when you look at that life cycle of that, you want to make sure that when a new feature comes out in a year from now, like say we just shipped dedupe, within the 9 frame, you don't want to be like, oh, this new feature came out. Oh, I have the wrong hardware for that. And that was a feature that I'm proud of the work engineering did. They kept metadata very low, so it's actually not as memory hungry as I probably would have guessed 2 or 3 years ago. But there's a bit of forecasting on that. But it also looks, as ESA is evolving, we can tighten that up quite a bit.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen that too with some incremental improvements throughout the various iterations since ESA has debuted. We've been making networking much more efficient. We've been making the data path much more efficient. And while we say that the new ReadyNodes apply to all versions of vSAN ESA, this is really knowing that we've implemented these latest enhancements, and we know that moving forward, when people are introducing it in their greenfield environments, that's going to be the appropriate sized hardware.
I like it. Well, hey, let's continue talking about vSAN, but in the context of availability. Pete, I saw this blog you put out a couple of weeks ago, and I've always been an availability guy, disaster recovery guy, and so this has always been a topic I find interesting. And I felt like the way you laid out this blog was really nice. It just really covered sort of every component someone needs to consider when it comes to availability. And so I thought it might be worth our time to sort of walk through it a little bit and just talk a little bit about the certain aspects of availability and what it looks like, what some of the vulnerabilities are, and what people should consider when they're planning their own architecture. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good. I think one of the motivations behind writing about this really came from our customers. It was our customers who were maybe familiar with a little bit of or various ways that they could protect an application and the data there, but they didn't have a comprehensive understanding between the various approaches. So, and then of course, they're trying to understand what is it that they need to protect in the first place. Sometimes they think about just the data, sometimes they think about just the application, and then hopefully they think about both. And that's really where we come in to play for the offerings that we have. But what it boils down to is that in most environments, you have 2 basic approaches that you can protect the applications themselves as well as the data that they produce or they consume. You can do it at the application level, which is something, it's a feature or function that is built in to that specific application. Or you could do it at the infrastructure layer, that being, the venerable vSphere HA, DRS, so forth. And then, of course, on the storage side, vSAN. And now there's trade-offs on one versus the other. And so the point of the post was to really walk through what these fundamental differences are and what the trade-offs are, and then look to see which may be the best option for them. Because oftentimes, if we're speaking with a customer who, they have their team of administrators in their environment, they may not even be familiar with the capabilities, the resilience capabilities that vSAN even has. Yet they're very tuned in on some of the administrative burdens of, let's say, application level administration and protection. It sounds easy and good with 1 or 2 applications, but what about 200 or 300 applications? Then all of a sudden it becomes a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, obviously, I would say, and I might be wrong in this, correct me if I am, but I would say like SQL, for example, is Microsoft SQL Server probably has one of the more advanced, availability, configurations, but they're not all built that way, right?
Right. Indeed. It's interesting when we think about this notion of availability, protection, these requirements that they have around that. But oftentimes there's these slippery definitions on what that means in the first place. Well, what is available? What is availability, and what is that return to availability, or making it fully available again? What are the time periods in which that can be achieved? These are things that are actually hard to define because they don't necessarily mean the same thing for everyone. So the key, I think, in understanding and comparing is really being able to level set the playing field so we can understand when an application says that it has a recovery point objective, meaning the period or the frequency that it's going to be protected, of 0, and then a recovery time objective of whatever given amount of time that it takes to recover. We have to know that there may be exceptions or some considerations around their versions of what that means versus infrastructure level availability and what RPOs and RTOs mean in that context.
One part of it is it's almost like a math problem going through, because I feel like if you just ask your users, you're like, do you want high availability at this layer or this layer? They're just going to say yes. I want it that layer. I want the hypervisor.
I want all the availability.
Yes. I mean, you do find those weirdos who are like, well, I'm a cloud native hipster and I believe in like, I run RAID 0 underneath because I'm sharded and 8. Those people, they're terrible. We'll ignore them. Miles isn't here for me to defend himself, but no, it's one of those things. If you start asking that question, but you need to start asking with the context of, hey, is going from a 3 minutes for HA to fire off and reboot the VM to 30 seconds, is that worth $40,000 or whatever that licensing complexity, OpEx, resource overhead of having that active app, and also validate that actually works and works in all failure scenarios? Because I sometimes find that I forget that vSphere HA is insanely bulletproof. Like, it just works. And to be fair to SQL here, always on is actually really good. But there's some application HAs out there that are really bad. Like, they just send a ping, it kind of works. Like, the failover times can sometimes be worse than vSphere HA. Or you just get to a situation to where there's gray zone failures to where a network degradation or something fails and they don't know what to do. They don't have all of the extra fencing that vSphere HA has and things like that. So it's you need to start saying, is it worth this cost? Have we considered all of the potential outliers that we may have this breach? And is there a better way to deliver it? And I love Pete's blog for kind of stepping through what these differences are and these terms and these things, but finding a way to bring that to business sense is fun.
It's really interesting because I think in a lot of ways, at least with one of the very large customers in the financial sector that I was speaking with about this, is that, there were some uncertainties on what their requirements were in the first place. And it's not any sort of criticism toward them, but oftentimes it's an understanding between an agreement between the application owners and then the infrastructure administration as well. What sorts of capabilities can be offered and what sort of constraints are there? So it was first understanding what the capabilities were of the two, and then looking through how can they step through to achieve the desired result. Do they or don't they need, let's say, a much shorter recovery time objective, being able to recover that application more quickly, or will something like vSphere HA at the infrastructure layer, will that be good enough? And if so, then that has massive implications for managing these things at scale.
Well, and Pete, what are some of the traps you see people kind of fall into in this complexity? Like, I've seen, as one example, people who try to have one SLA for everything. They try to have one design paradigm, and and then they say, well, this is too expensive to do it this way. But what are some of the common problems people get overly bogged down in with this?
Yeah, oftentimes they will look at the solution first and then just simply move forward. So sort of the ready, fire, aim approach.
They found a reference architecture. We have a reference architecture for doing app HA on top of stretch clusters. Let's do it. Go.
We've got a plan.
Yes, that's exactly it. And so oftentimes they'll move forward in that approach and saying, okay, I'm going to use some application level replication that provides that high availability. but not understand some of the limitations and the implications and some of the administrative burdens that are needed around there. So now you're introducing these operational complexities that were something that maybe they didn't even initially think about. Then, of course, you're factoring in other topology matters, geographic and so forth, that can say, well, maybe based off of the original scope or the original charter, this was something that now falls outside of that boundary. So how can they figure out a better way to essentially achieve the same result? Everybody wants to keep the application up and the data available. That's the bottom line. If you can remove yourself from this idea about, I think I already know the way, and just really assess it in a very objective way, you can figure out what's going to be the best path forward.
When discovering all of those limitations or those operational headaches is going to be kind of fun, because some people may not know what they don't know, but you may naively assume certain things will keep working. Like, I didn't realize this till I ran into it, but your backup software has to be aware of a lot of clustered applications, where it has to have special functions, or you have to stun the multiple instances, or some of these cross consistency issues that sometimes come up, or like historically shared LUN multi-writer volumes, for instance, like you can't snapshot them. So V80P is out the window. You're going to have to do app-based backups or things like that. Thinking through all that stuff, it starts to be, I think people sometimes see these reference architectures, they see this penultimate North Star of ultimate availability, and then they don't realize, oh wait, there's second order effects of choosing that design paradigm or following that RA.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, it's one thing to have a SQL server that, and you've got your always on availability groups, but if it's all sitting on one host and that host goes down.
Cluster in a box. I forgot about that. Yeah, that was a thing back in the day. Yeah.
So what I know there's been a lot of evolution in terms of high availability. Maybe we can sort of walk through some of that and maybe share some ideas for folks.
Sure. So when we think about availability, of course, remember we're going to be focusing on the availability of the application state itself, whether it's one or more VMs, and then, of course, the availability of the data itself. And so the good news is VCF has capabilities that help accommodate both. So on the application state, that VM instance, of course, that would be vSphere HA. And, this could be something, saying in understanding availability, is availability within a given boundary of failure, like a zone or a single site. Is that good enough? Well, then if that's the case, then a simple vSAN cluster where the that VM instance will be running within the vSphere cluster and kind of managed by DRS and HA, that will be sufficient. If the boundary of failure needs to extend beyond something greater than that, like a single site, then you might have something like a stretch cluster that would help achieve this notion of saying the application will remain up or will become highly available as a result of that topology. Now, will it remain available for the entire duration at which there was an instance of a failure? No, because in our case, we don't have, in this case, VMs, two concurrent VMs that are running, and one's kind of in a cold state, one's in a hot state. We have to restart that VM in that other location. And so when you have those kinds of things, that there's going to be natural processes that have to occur in order to get that thing to restart. So we have restart times that are a little bit longer than typically what you might see with application level replication. By time you factor in all of the heart beating that goes on with vSphere HA, plus some of the mechanisms within vSAN, we're simply going to be a little bit longer. Now on the storage side, same thing goes for that. We know that we can say the boundary of failure, if it's going to be within a single site, great, you can just make a standard vSAN cluster. Or if you need to extend that outside of let's say a single site, then you can make that a stretch cluster. And so now you have this sort of nice blend of saying application state and storage can be made highly available, where we are synchronously writing the data, but it's all just about the recovery time that's going to be a little bit different than application level availability.
All right. Well, I know on your blog, Pete, you shared some real world examples, and we're going to again link to the blog on bottom of the screen here if you're watching the video, and in the show notes if you're listening. But maybe we can walk through some typical examples of application versus infrastructure availability.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the common ways that we see this implemented at the application level would be a customer would have a couple of vSphere clusters or vSAN clusters, and they're sitting at two discrete sites. Or let's say they're on the same site, but at different campus buildings and so forth, something like that. In those cases, what they would do, they would have something like SQL always on availability groups running. They would have more than one instance of that SQL VM running at each location. And then it is SQL that is entirely responsible for making sure that that data is synchronously replicated. And in the event of a failure, some sort of a failure, that it will reprovision or turn that other SQL server live at the point of a failure. Now, it surprisingly enough, it uses a similar approach toward understanding if a site is available or not available compared to vSAN. The notion of a quorum sort of still exists there. It uses simply a file share in most cases, but this is something that we see as far as a common approach for application layer availability. Now, by way of comparison, you can achieve the same result using vSAN in that same sort of topology, where you would have a vSAN stretch cluster spanning those two buildings, but instead of having two SQL server instances, you would just have one. So we replicate the data synchronously, of course, courtesy of the stretch cluster topology and the storage policy that's associated with it. But that VM, of course, is protected via HA, and it will, of course, reinstantiate itself or restart itself on the appropriate site in the event of a failure. These are the two approaches that we see, and the biggest difference typically beyond the administration side of it, because you sort of let go of all of that administration from application side once you do it at the infrastructure level. But generally, we will see a higher recovery time objective, or the time that it takes for that VM to restart itself at the remote location. That's generally going to be the biggest difference between the two.
Well, and from a failover time, that's one of the considerations, and it's also when you think through that instance, you've got that other side that you're having to pre-warm that allocation, but you also would have to reserve the space anyway. So from a resource basis, it's not necessarily a huge swing, but there are other considerations you have to think about or implications. Sometimes some applications that do cluster, they sometimes have licensing provisions for if the second site isn't active, you don't have to license the app. There may be cases where you want to run a secondary instance, because sometimes people use that as a read-only mirror and they run reporting off of that. Or backups off of that. More advanced cases. This is one of the cases where you, as the VMware admin, need to go have a chat with the application person and say, "Look, do you want to manage this stuff?" Also, part of my memory of always on configuration goes, you actually have to have the connectors that are connecting to it aware of both endpoints. You actually have to have client awareness. Do they want to manage all that? And some people are like, I want to own that SLA. I want to manage that. Sometimes they say, you know what, 3 minutes, it's going to take users that long. They're going to go make a cup of coffee. They'll come back. If you think about the normal HA time, that's about the amount of time people go, huh, that's funny. Let me go check my email, or let me go get coffee. Oh, it's back. So there's a difference between, oh, this is life and death, we're going to lose millions of dollars in transactional volume or something. And, oh, I'm going to mildly annoy someone for an extra 2 minutes, of which they probably, we're just going to go stare outside or something for that time anyways.
I wonder what the percentage is, because there's obviously when we talk about availability, we're always talking about the stock market. You have to have zero RPOs, zero RTOs. Everything has to be always on. But what would be a realistic percentage? And Pete, you don't have to answer this, but just I'm always curious. Is like how many people are more like what John's talking about, where it's like, oh something's not working. It's I think it's frozen for a second.
Call the help
there it
desk.
is. It's fine. And then let's move on.
And nobody's like, it's. My guess out there, and I talk to customers big and small, there are some really large shops who it's like, okay, this database is doing this important financial thing. We have 40,000 of them. They're all clustered. Good for you. You get to your mid-size enterprise and manufacturing or something where they might have some real-time process where it's very urgent. They have very low failover. Weirdly, people who monitor temperatures and pharmacy, like they have some like very weird regulatory requirements that they like have to have a temperature pull every so many minutes or something. But when you get outside of that stuff, I would guess 90% of databases out there they're not doing app clustering. And we're talking about Microsoft SQL in this context today. When we start talking about Oracle RAC and some of these other ones that have much more exotic configurations to do that clustering, that said, RAC's pretty cool. No shame there, to my Oracle friends. But the juice worth the squeeze ratio of how much time I want to put into this, whether I want to take the easy button, it's really, I'm willing to bet 9 out of 10 databases out there don't go through this. I don't know, Pete. Do you have a finger in the wind, guess?
I don't, but what I do know is oftentimes that with many of these companies who have dedicated administrators focusing on their databases, is they're actually pretty well in tune with these concepts around availability. And so they know things like these principles around availability and consistency and so forth. So they're always bringing up these very sophisticated techniques that are used in the database world. And so we have to be able to answer those questions of, well, wait a minute, if let's say a SQL server is completing these transactions with the appropriate method of correctness or atomicity, how does vSAN do that? And what we have to show them is actually we do the very same thing, but just at a different layer. And that's really what we try to showcase here. And oftentimes we can have a customer go, well, wow, that's a new, interesting way to think about it. It's actually an old way to think about it. It's when we think about data consistency across a distributed storage system. So, but we simply do things sort of at that lower end storage layer, the SCSI layer. But because of that, we can achieve such flexibility and simplify that administration that becomes so complex at scale on the application side.
What's old is new.
Indeed.
You talk about that. You talk about that simplicity. The other thing is you've got that database administrator who has to do this configuration, but you don't stop at the database to make a highly available application that users can connect in. You need your middleware. You need your front end web servers. You'll need load balancers. I mean, maybe you just do round robin or something, DNS or IP, but maybe you have some fancy level 7 load balancer that's inspecting the health of that. Chasing every 9 you add adds an extra cost or an extra amount of complexity or an operational cost. And that, shaving increasingly smaller amounts of time off of that failure window becomes it's almost like an exponential curve of complexity and cost across the environment. That said, the VCF platform can help you automate, deliver, configure. We can do all these things. We can, but.
And what's interesting too is that I think, this blends in with sort of another offering that is within the kind of the VCF suite is DSM. So if you say, you know what, I want to have this idea of running our databases locally, but I kind of don't want to manage them, but I want to store them here. That is a great sort of in-between approach that you can achieve this idea of locally administered databases without some of the administration complexity that may occur when you're just doing everything on your own. So.
DSM, Data Services Manager. John and I have had some good podcasts on that as well. We'll leave some links in the show notes for that as well. So Pete, how do people make these decisions, to decide which one is right for them?
Yeah. So number one, I would really take a hard look at what the business requirements are. So, if you're looking at a case where you have extremely low recovery time objectives, that thing has to be up extremely fast. And, extremely fast may be based off of whatever you think that is, but let's get a number on it. Let's actually quantify what that recovery time is. That would be the main one. You're going to deal with some of these other factors when sorting through that. What is the additional gain in reduced licensing costs if you go with sort of infrastructure level availability, as well as operational costs from a lack of needing to have dedicated subject matter experts on every single clustered application? Because again, a lot of these things work great in a one-off or a two-off scenario, but when at scale, weird things happen. And it happens even with operational complexities, runbooks, configurations, updates,
Anti-affinity
and so forth.
rules, all the other fun stuff.
Yeah. And then finally, one of the things that has come up with several of our customers, they were interested in what infrastructure level availability could do because they were being challenged by some of the costs from the applications themselves on making sure that you had 3 other instances of that sitting on standby in order to achieve that result. And so if you can factor that in, I think that's a great starting point in figuring out what's best for you. And you may find that, in some cases, you can do 99% infrastructure level availability. And if you want to stick with that one application that you really appreciate and enjoy the resilience capabilities of that application, then that's fine. You can run both. But here we have these options for you.
I love how you say you enjoy that application, because I feel like anything I carried a pager for that needed 7 nines availability was not something I enjoyed at 3 a.m. And I'm like, no.
Yeah, there's no enjoyment in that.
No, that's sort of a dubious distinction there for sure.
Well, and it's, I also love that we've managed to get through this entire availability discussion, and we've managed to not say the words fault tolerance yet. But it's a feature. It's out there. The people who need it, they know they need it, generally because someone's going to die, and and there was no other way to cluster that application that way. But it is interesting seeing there's always other ways to protect this stuff, and I feel like going down the RAS rabbit hole of what is it? Resiliency, availability, serviceability is what that acronym stands for. There's all kinds of like weird things you can do to raise availability, even outside the app tier. Memory mirroring. We're going to mirror all our DEMs, or we're going to run lockstep on 2 mainframe CPU. There's always been this kind of chasing of this, and this is, even if this goes beyond your database environment, this is something, being able to quantify this, learn how to these operational, this is a good thing to practice in your environment.
Yeah. And I think, finally, one of the things that is often misunderstood by some of our customers when it comes to this idea of availability, and especially on a distributed storage solution like vSAN, is that, we have some world-class engineering that has created this fully distributed storage system that adheres to all of the principles that apply in this notion of distributed storage, data consistency, atomicity, isolation, durability, all of these things. It's built in. And that's the thing that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about, is vSAN a good option for these sorts of scenarios?
I like it. Application versus infrastructure level high availability with vSAN in VMware Cloud Foundation. Author Pete Koehler, also guest on his podcast and good friend of ours. Pete, thanks so much for joining us on Virtually Speaking. Link below Pete's pretty face. That's the short link for the blog. Also in the show notes. As always, Pete, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.